figure out which way is south, you point it that way, and then you can go along the way. And along the middle, you can sort of see how it works. Right? As the wheels turn in opposite directions, the top guy spins around. If they're in the same direction, then it happens. Okay, great. And so the only other tidbit about the south-pointing chariots that I like is the reason they're called south-pointing and not east-facing or west-facing or north-facing is because they were invented in China, where if you went north, that was when barbarians and Mongolians like ate you and you never came back home. Right? So you wanted to know wherever you were going, how you get back to safety, which is always go south. Okay, the second example actually comes from, it looks a lot like Street View. And what a lot of people think is that Street View is fantastic. What a lot of people don't know is that they had this in 1907. It was Rand McNally's claim to fame, now famous Atlas people. And it came at the same time, 2 years later, it came with what's called the Jones Live Map. So this is a picture sort of turn by turn. If you wanted, in this particular case, this book was to get from New York to Albany. And every single turn along the way, they had a photo of what it looked like and which way you wanted to turn. Can you believe it was 100 years ago? What was crazy, though, is when I stumbled upon this, which is called the Jones Live Map. It's a little wheel that sits here, and you attach a little cable from here to your odometer. And so every kilometer or mile that you travel, it turns this wheel just a little bit along the way. And each marking on here, as you get to it, points to a page on this map where you have to look for a turn. Right? So way before GPS, way before everything that we sort of take for granted today, people painstakingly charted out turns, charted out the distance between turns, and had them wire up into cars so you could figure out where they were. And believe it or not, people love this. And so why don't we, we're pretty spoiled today, if there's a good point. Okay, so this presentation is broken up into two acts. The first is sort of present day. We're going to do a quick review of how GPS works. So a lot of you are probably really familiar with it. Some of you maybe not. We'll get on the same page. And we'll talk about some nuances of why it doesn't work everywhere. And then sort of some interesting takes on recent work, its limitations. And Act 2 will sort of be some of the modern innovations. Okay, so how GPS works, right? So everyone knows there's a constellation of satellites out there, and there's enough, I think 32, they keep launching more, that you can always see at least 4, hopefully more, at any point in time. And the reason for that is because you need 4 to figure out where you are. Small tidbit, the details aren't important, but I like to tell the story, which is that everything, our cell phone today, so CDMA, which is sort of like LTE, everything we take for granted about all the data that we're getting through, wouldn't be possible if GPS wasn't invented. It was the same invention of how to get multiple signals on the same frequency to talk to different receivers as it is to figure out where and how far you are from any particular satellite. And the simplest way to think about this is that each satellite has this code it goes through of 1s and 0s. And it's a predetermined pattern, and it's really, really long. And so what's interesting is that if you know the pattern and you start looking for it, you can line yourself up with where it is in the pattern, and you can compute, if you have an atomic clock and they have an atomic clock, how much delay there is between when it was supposed to have sent that message, right, which is a predetermined, super long sequence, and when you actually received it. And so everything in GPS operates on the principle of speed of light. Right, and so you have 3 satellites. You know basically the delay between when they sent it and when you received the message. You can divide by the speed of light, which is like an enormous number. And you sort of get a certain distance from each satellite, right? And so what I want to point out here is that everyone says triangulation. There are no angles involved here. Triangulation is actually what you use when you go to the beach and you want to find out how far away a boat is because someone's down on one end of the beach and the other person's at the other end and you're measuring angles. This is trilateration. But for the sake of the entire industry, I'm going to continue calling it triangulation because that's what people are using. So, right, so the idea is pretty simple. Like if you can get a distance from each of the 3 satellites, then you can only be here. And it's not so bad. The real world is actually in 3D. And so there's 2 points, usually not nearly as ambiguous because they're often on opposite sides of the world. But by and large, it's the same problem. Now, there is one caveat, which is for all of this to work, you have to have an atomic clock in your receiver. And it turns out no one actually does. The reason GPS was so fantastic is because all the receivers cost like $20, and then now they're $400 because people try to sell you these fancy, and I'll talk to you about that in a moment. But fundamentally, the satellites were the expensive part. They were put into space, and as long as they're working, you can always get really, really cheap location for anyone who's listening. And the secret to this is basically you add a 4th like virtual atomic clock, right? So if you have 3 equations and 3 unknowns, because you have the distances from each satellite, then you can solve this equation as is. If you add a 4th equation, which is what is the atomic clock time on my virtual atomic clock that I don't have, then you just need a 4th, for the 4th unknown, you need a 4th equation, right? And so it turns out if you can see 4 satellites, then you have 1 extra equation to solve for that 1 extra variable. And if you're lucky, you'll be able to see 5 or 6 at any point in time. And we'll talk about why it gets bad when you can't. But okay, so this is like the textbook review of how GPS works. And it's all fine and dandy. It turns out no modern GPS receivers use this philosophy anymore. So I remember in high school when they taught us, like, oh, you have these electrons that they orbit and they're like planets and they pair up and stuff, and then you move on to later fields and they're like, oh, it's actually a cloud, it's quantum mechanics, and it's never anywhere. Hopefully I'm going to blow your mind. Okay, so the Doppler effect. Everyone knows about this because cars drive by, and it's like this high frequency when it's moving towards you, and it's this low frequency when you're moving away. Everyone's learned about this. Everyone knows that it exists. But what you don't realize is that this is now the primary way that you and your GPS receivers use satellite information to figure out where you are. So the old way of ranging is inaccurate for a lot of reasons. And you can sort of use it to coarsely find out where you are, maybe 10, 50 meters, depending on noise situations. But what's really interesting about a satellite is that you're always moving away from it or toward it. And because of the way the satellites are entirely predictable, you always know where that satellite is in space. So rather than try to do this crazy atomic clock, distance, triangulation, trilateration thing, all receivers now do is they simply measure the sound, the frequency of the signal coming from each satellite to determine whether you're moving away from it or toward it. And if you can do that, first of all, you don't need your own atomic clock to do that once you have the fix. And secondly, if you can do that for 3 satellites, you can solve for your position incrementally. If you do it for 4, you get to reduce error. You can do it for 5, even better. But next time someone tells you it has to do with the speed of light and you're dividing, tell them this is how it works now. Also, this is why it costs $400 per GPS receiver. It's not the cheap 10-cent stuff. Okay. But why is all this interesting? It's because GPS doesn't work everywhere. We've taken it for granted for a lot of reasons. And as I mentioned before, the biggest problem is reflection. We don't live on this Earth that has nothing on it. Signals reflect through things. Sometimes they have to pass through stuff. Turns out the frequency that they chose GPS to work on, 1.5 gigahertz, is optimal in the sense that it doesn't diffuse through water. Unfortunately, that means it completely diffuses through pine cones. So, you have certain areas where you can't get the signal. You have certain areas where, because it's reflecting, the direction or the distance that you measure doesn't quite line up, right? So if we're using the time ranging approach, and it takes this long to get to you, and you divide by the speed of light, you're going to think you're further from the satellite. Similarly, if you're using the Doppler effect, right, and you feel like if you're moving this way, you get a high frequency, but the satellite's over there, and so now the equations say you're moving this way, but you're actually moving this way because of reflection. Reflection is a huge problem. What's even worse is awesome cities, right? So I was going to make a statement about like rural versus urban. I'm not going to. But basically, urban canyons, right, where everyone lives, Manhattans of the world, Los Angeles of the world, anywhere there's tall buildings. Often, you can't even see the 4 satellites to solve the equation in the first place. And I know a lot of you have probably run into this. I've heard from GPS experts that the exact quote is, the deep dark secret in the GPS industry is that in the most populated areas on Earth, GPS is only accurate to 250 meters. So let's talk about what that means. Well, we'll talk about what that means in a minute. But first, even when it is working, there's a reason we need more than GPS. And that's this. A typical accuracy of GPS when performing well, let's say it's plus or minus 10 meters, that spans you from here to here. And as long as I know you're in a car, you're not in the bushes, and you're probably moving one direction, that's enough to put you more or less where you need to be from a logical point of view. Unfortunately, when we start talking about indoors, which we'll do in a moment, you're going to realize that plus or minus 10 meters is the difference between floor 6 over here and floor 13. And getting the floor wrong by like 6 or 7 floors is a huge nuisance if you're trying to do interesting things with location. And just to sort of drive this point home a little bit, this is a study not done by indoor positioning marketers, but actually by the EPA. They were doing an air quality study to figure out where air quality is more important. Should we fight smog, or should we get better filters? But the result of this is they found that humans spend 90% of their time indoors and only 10% of their time outdoors. And that means that's a huge chunk of time we don't have access to location. A related study of 911 cell phone calls was they found 60-40. A lot of people, though, they don't have reception indoors. They have to get just outdoors to take that phone call. It's still pretty good. Okay, so what do we do, right? A lot of people talk about Wi-Fi, they talk about cell towers, they talk about signal strength, and maybe we can overcome some of these problems. And the original sort of approaches here were to go map out, if we could, the locations. There are giant databases, Google's got one, Apple's got one, Broadcom's got one, everyone in this industry that sells GPS chips is actually doing Wi-Fi and cell tower trilateration. They have these giant databases of where every cell tower is, where every access point is, and based on the signal strengths that you're seeing, right, these chips are combo chips that receive both GPS signals, and they can read the signal strengths of the cell towers and the Wi-Fi. You can tell roughly how far away you are from each one, because the further you get, the weaker the signal gets. And that's a start, and that's the reason, actually, in urban canyons, your GPS still puts you on the right road. If you're unlucky, it might be a block over. The problem for us, though, is that this doesn't work indoors. And we're going to talk a little bit about why with some more pictures. So here's an example of sort of like the transmit patterns of various ways through an indoor space. And you'll find, first of all, nothing is line of sight. And so you're getting reflections off everything, waveguides off everything. And in this case, it's just reflections. Often, you get signals that pass through walls. And so there's all sorts of different types of interference. And more or less, we took a real measurement in a building in Palo Alto. And if you look, this is signal strength. So the red is where it's strongest, and the blue is where it's weakest. It is not uniform at all, right? It's sort of
Stardex.
Yeah, it's a Stardex, by the way. Stardex is awesome. You should go visit it. They're here. But so you can tell the access point is here because that's where it's the strongest. The Wi-Fi is emitting from it. But you'll notice that basically anywhere you have line of sight, it's still pretty strong. As soon as you have to go through one wall or two walls, it completely drops out. Right? And so the intuition I always talk about when we talk in our industry is that if I took an access point and I put it up in this corner here, and then I tore down all the walls, all the ceilings, all the floors in this room, you would actually get 100% signal strength, no matter where you were. Because there's nothing, you have line of sight, there's nothing blocking you. And so if it turns out we have tons of Wi-Fi, but you're just getting 100% signal strength for everything, how are we ever going to solve this positioning problem? There's like no data, everything just has 100%. What's worse, so you're lucky because you do have walls and signals do drop. But what's worse is sort of some of the ambiguities that are here. Right? So first of all, they have this idea that if there's enough different access points and you sort of have signal strength for enough of them, and they are getting weaker because of things that are happening, then maybe we can start guessing where they are. This was the first approach that people tried to take. The problem is in each of these diagrams, the signal strength pattern at location A and the signal strength pattern at location B are exactly the same. Great. So you might, okay, fine, right? We can find a way around that. There's some things we can be able to talk about as solutions. What gets me even more upset is that, forget A and B. Like, say we're standing somewhere and we do a signal strength scan to see the strength of all the Wi-Fi's that are around us to somehow get a guess at where we are. If you do the same scan 100 times, you will get widely different signal strengths, right? All the way down to basically 0, and the bulk of them over here. But the fact that it's stochastic means unless you're standing there getting a whole ton of scans, you can't really home in on where you are. The signal reading of a signal strength that's actually strong can just as likely come out the same as one that's outside the building. And the reason I mentioned outside the building is because even if you feel like you can solve all of these problems, right, if you can go back and you can predict, I know I have an access point here, I know I have the material of the walls and the thickness of the floors, and we're going to get this attenuation through this floor, we're going to get this wave guiding through this section of the building. Most of the access points you see, or we see in practice, actually come from outside and come in through windows. What are you going to do, model the whole world for each building, right? And so it becomes very, very difficult, very, very fast. There is actually literature on sort of these people who do try to model this stuff, where they, have an access point, they model what it looks like, they do a bunch of ray tracing. The graphics people get really good at this because they have a ray tracing background. But it's not really going anywhere. I'd love to see this take off. Unfortunately, even in this diagram, you can tell that like black and white is fine to know where the walls are, but you've got to know the material, the thickness, and the shape of all of them, whether the doors open or close, and where people are standing. If you can't do that, you can't really model it. So, okay. So how did Wi-Fi become so interesting indoors then, in the first place? And what we're really talking about is fingerprinting, right? The idea that if I take a signal strength scan, and I listen to all the access points that are available, maybe I don't know the thickness of the material of the walls, I don't know what the attenuation is going to be, but over time, if I do enough scans in one place, you do get that profile. And if we can just wait long enough, maybe we can start figuring out where we are. The reason the biggest push actually in this space, where this took off, was a company named Ekahau. This is not a video from Ekahau, but just to show you sort of what kind of data they collect. I'm going to jump through here. They have this process where you walk into your room, you press capture, and then you spin in a circle. Looks like lots of fun, actually. For 30 seconds. And it's painfully slow to make you watch it, just so you get the effect of sort of like what's really going on here. He's only half done.
Is this what you do in your free time?
Oh yeah, so, right, oh wait, and then, okay, so he got his 1 point, right? Now we're talking. Let's do one more point. What does that look like? Oh look, he's over there. Hey, would you look at that? What do you think's gonna happen next? So right now, what's crazy about how tedious this looks is that this was game-changing when it was brought to the market. Because if you can go back, if you really can generate these charts at a variety of points throughout a building, it is enough information to solve for where you are. And it wasn't the capturing that was exciting for people, but it was the fact that we could produce these charts at all. And so what I have next is a demonstration of sort of how you can use data like this to solve for position in a stochastic manner. Just before we show the video, I just want to give you a highlight of what you're going to be looking at. So the systems that are generally used and put in place here are a collection of hypotheses. This idea comes from genetic algorithms, if you have experience with genetic algorithms. There's a bunch of different, you have this population of things that are all guessing at where you are. And they move through space, and their fit function is according to how well they fit that distribution that we saw of all the Wi-Fi access points that you're seeing. And so what you're going to see in each frame is the blue is a weak fit area, the reds and the yellows and the greens are a strong fit area, and you're going to see dots where the actual population, your genetic population is. See if it will play. And look at slow down button.
This is where you start dancing.
Yeah, well, no, actually, this is the art of suspense. Christopher Nolan invented it, and we're just going to try it out. Okay, good. So this is, I think, like a local retail store. But what's crazy about... Yeah, oh, it's a Walmart. Great, it's a local Walmart. What's crazy about this that you'll notice is that on any particular measurement, as I mentioned, the measurements are so random that the highest likelihood sections are actually totally different from where you are. And it requires you to run sort of a stochastic algorithm that accounts for history to keep your sort of population in place within reason at all. We can let this go through one more time. Just remember, the dark blue is sort of like where we kill off the population. The red and yellow and green areas are where they're deemed to fit better. And the black dots here are sort of the particles as they go through. Right? And just the thing to take away from this is even if we have a perfect map of what the signal strengths are supposed to look like, the actual measurements you're seeing are so randomly in Discord that really only in large averages do they sort of converge to the solutions that we have here. Okay. Switch back. Sometimes I forget to show the video. Right, so what this means is WiFiSLAM, one of the things we do at WiFiSLAM is try to eliminate this measuring and spinning a circle action. To try to make indoor location as accessible as possible to anyone who wants to try it. To sort of show you this working, I'll talk you through this.
Is SLAM an acronym?
It is, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Yes, SLAM is an acronym. The idea here is that this is an app anyone can download. You can go on our website, you can get it yourself. And this entire video is 90 seconds, and it shows anyone can sort of take a smartphone, a personal smartphone, run this software, capture a very, very small amount of information, and launch live indoor positioning wherever they are. Right? So what's happening here is, we're not spinning around in circles, we're not walking, recording a bunch of points. You just tell the phone where you are against a floor plan. We took at the beginning you might have noticed you just took a photo of one of the emergency exit maps. And you only have to walk once to every location you want to have location. So we happen to, you want to do this one hallway here and the main hallway. Right? This is not staged. People we don't know are walking in front of us. right? You hit stop, you upload, and that's it. And so this SDK, Quick Map, is available to sort of anyone who visits the website, anyone who wants to try it out. And the one thing we've learned from being an indoor location is people don't need to be told how cool a location is. Everyone, their first question is, but does it really work? And so we've made it our mission to make it as easy as possible for someone to pull a phone out of their pocket and see it work on their own. Right? So we spent 90 seconds capturing some data. This is following you through the hallway. And anyone can do this.
So when you walked through the first time, were you recording the signals that you were hearing?
That's right, that's right. So we record the entire sequence of signals from start to finish, and we use those patterns to figure out where you are. Let's skip this next video in the interest of time.
The signals you're picking up from local Wi-Fi, you know, the person's Wi-Fi at their desk that their computer's using, or what are you picking up?
Yeah, so it's any hotspot that basically responds to probe requests. And so that means it can be hidden, it can be password protected. As long as the signals are in the air, we can use those signal strengths to figure out where you are.
So you can map places that have a lot of Wi-Fi.
Yeah, yeah. And so what's,
They don't.
well, remember, what's interesting is most of the Wi-Fi actually leaks in from neighboring buildings and neighboring floors through the windows. And having a weak signal is just as valuable as having a strong signal. Because if you're in a dead zone, I know you can't be where the signal is strong. Yeah, go.
And you could, for instance, tag location and be able to locate them in the hospital.
Yeah, yeah, exactly that. And that's whether they're wearing a tag or they have their own phone. That's exactly right. Right?
Is there any restrictions on that floor plan that you have in terms of, I don't know, binary or on rails that you can start to do, image processing on that thing?
Yeah, so there are no restrictions. The video we saw, there's a camera mode where you can just walk up to any map that you see and snap a photo of it. Some people draw a picture on a napkin and take a picture of that. And then sort of the more professional people, they already have museums and stuff. They already have digital layouts that they want to present to the user. They just upload those to the web. Yeah.
Yeah, how brittle is that in the sense that, the signal varies based on doors opening and closing, other things that are happening. Does that take into account some of that?
Yeah, so in fact, we try to take into account all of it. The major breakthroughs, I think, of WiFiSLAM's SDK as released today is that it can take into account so many things. We have worked really, really hard to try to take into account more factors to compensate for the fact that you're not capturing as much information.
Well, I was thinking mostly in terms of changes, during the day, during the week, in terms of different signal strengths, doors being open rather than closed, and so the signal strengths and such are changing.
Right, right. And if you remember, that's the reason when we saw the Walmart video, that the individual scans actually put you totally in different parts of the store. And the most important thing is to have the right probabilistic models to average that kind of stuff out.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
The technology depends on measuring the current RF environment, which can change with the introduction of a new access point, let's say by a neighbor, or the removal of an access point by the first neighbor.
That's right.
How do you account for the non-persistence of the
So the first answer is MAC addressing. We'll get back to that in a moment. The second is the intuition I like to talk about is that if your phone is doing a scan every second, and you walk down the hallway for 30 seconds, you create a sequence of scans as you walk down that hallway that is so unique enough. It's sort of like the DNA of that hallway. It's a DNA sequence that the next person that walks down that hallway, the sequence could be different in a lot of ways because of the things you're talking about, but certain aspects of that pattern will be similar enough that we can correlate you, not any individual scan, but the entire sequence at a time.
How persistent is that if you've already scanned, you're using the technology in position, and an AP moves, it's non-valid?
So moving APs we can detect, and I'll talk to you, it's more complicated, so we'll talk to you about that offline. The most typical case actually we find is that an AP breaks and then replace it with another one. Or a store in a mall goes down and they construct a bunch of new ones. MAC addresses, in order for the internet to work at all, layer 2 of the OSI requires that MAC addresses are universally unique. So every Wi-Fi device has a universal identifier
Unless they come from China and then you have the problem.
Yeah, unless they come from China, then they're a little bit duplicate. But like, you never run into real duplicates. And because of that, if I take down a store and I put up a new one, all of those we can immediately flag as new and need to be relearned. And the old ones that we can't see anymore, we can flag as gone. And it's because of that unique identifier that makes this so powerful.
So let him go through his act, his second act, and then we can
Yeah, well, I
ask
can
more
show you this
questions.
pretty quickly
Yeah.
if you want to get any questions. So monitor breakthroughs. So now that we sort of set the stage for how things work today and what's exciting, I want to talk about some things that are really game changing in this space. The first is SLAM, and we'll find out what the acronym stands for. It actually talks about simultaneous localization and mapping. I mean, what this means is, even at the beginning, even in our video, we were showing you doing some recording of data. It turns out there's a way to do this with no recording at all. And as long as you have enough trajectories through an entire space, eventually some of their Wi-Fi sequences will match up. And if we can start piece by piece, like a puzzle, re-overlapping these sequences, you can do something similar to what we have here, where you can start to fold these paths back on top of each other. So in this video, the green is sort of the raw trajectory of a phone using just inertial sensing. The blue is sort of, we're running SLAM using WiFiSLAM's probabilistic models. And you'll find that, the green has already drifted out, jumped out a window, and is probably outside the building. Whereas, as long as there are commonalities in the video itself, as long as there are commonalities in the sequences themselves, it can figure out that it's the same path or a different path, push it away from where it is, and fold it over where it should be.
So are you repeatedly tracing this path? Or is this just one path? How many?
Yeah, so this is actually like the Gates building of Stanford, if you've been there. There's like an elevator here, and then there's these hallways, and then like things that go, a couple like joining hallways that go up and down. So this is actually a rectangular section of a building.
Is that one person's scan?
That is one person's path. Yeah, Morgan quickly took a phone and walked around for 15 minutes.
So are you uploading data to servers and sharing multiple paths for multiple users?
Yes, and that's exactly how you can sort of aggregate very, very robust databases of this information.
And so wouldn't that shorten the scan time, the startup scan time for
Yeah.
any one person?
Exactly. Sure. Go ahead.
So there is the assumption, though, that this is, there's a dynamic assumption about this being a continuous path, right? I mean, if phone went down, phone came up again, you might be a little bit of loss.
Yeah, that's right. So the things that aren't continuous, we have to rely on sort of the non-planar overlapping, where you can take multiple paths and align them.
Signature.
Yeah, I guess at a higher level. And then the individual path in that video, we just use a single path because it's more fun to watch. The videos with multiple paths, like it's kind of hard to follow. But the idea is the same. You can match up. There's no sort of requirement that this path and that path came from the same trajectory. If that makes sense. Great. Okay, so the next is inertial, and I know a lot of you guys probably touch on this a lot. Dead reckoning is a big field, sort of in outdoor navigation. And the points I want to point out here are that we haven't even scratched the tip of the iceberg when you start talking about smartphones and what's possible. This slide is basically telling you the opposite, that smartphones are terrible, their sensors are super cheap, and we can't get any meaningful information out of them. And so this particular approach was to take off the shelf a system that works outdoors, a system that people are used to for cars or planes or whatever dead reckoning is available, and just plugging it into sort of the $3 sensors, gyroscopes that are on phones. That's the actual path that we walked, and this is what comes out if you sort of use what's off the shelf. What's interesting is if you look at sort of like the gyroscope reading over time, as you do this walk, every time you take a step, it jolts it, and you get like a spurious reading. When you do make turns, there's dips and valleys and hills and things, and you can, if you integrate this over time, naively, you get sort of this chart that we saw before. The thing I want to point out, though, that's really interesting to sort of machine learning and pattern rec people like us, is that this is the accelerometer. Now, the accelerometer can't measure the angle that you're turning. It can't, right? Because it only tells you whether you're, a linear velocity if you integrate. But what's interesting is people hold phones in front of them, and when you turn your body, you get a centripetal acceleration. And if you notice where the individual anomalies are in the accelerations that you see, they correlate exactly to where turns are taking place. And so if you break out of the mold of sort of the high school physics that people use to sort of just push, acceleration means acceleration, and angular velocity means angular velocity, and you start applying pattern rec and machine learning algorithms to this approach, we can reproduce the sort of quality that you get in a gyroscope using just the accelerometer alone. And if you have both of those available on the phone, you can do some really interesting things. I hope you're excited, there's even more. So TDOA is called time difference of arrival. And if you remember, one of the things we talk about with Wi-Fi signal strengths is that they aren't uniform. They don't, there is no direct relationship between how far you are from an access point and what signal strength you're seeing, because it has to do with the number and the thickness and material of the walls and floors between you and them. But what's interesting is every time you send a packet to an access point and it replies, these packets are actually traveling at the speed of light. And the people who make access points and the people who make phones have caught on to the value of location, and they're starting to track how long these individual radio chains take. And once again, if that's available, it wasn't traditionally available because Wi-Fi was really just meant to send data to you, but if as manufacturers start to put newer and newer versions of things out there, more and more chips will be able to tell you not only what the picture in the YouTube video was that you were watching, but how long every individual packet took for you to ask for it and get back. And what that means is, once again, we can divide by the speed of light. So if you take the speed of light and divide by, take the amount of time each packet from each AP access point gets to you, divide by the speed of light, you can actually get a pretty rough, you have to divide by 2 also, you can get a pretty rough estimate of where you are once again. We're back to trilateration, or as the industry calls it, triangulation. And you can see some of these early Cisco operations where you can see the time difference of arrival fading almost uniformly as a circle. The biggest hurdle with this is that the technology is not quite out there yet to capture all this data, and a lot of manufacturers are working hard to sort of put it in, and when it comes out, I think it'll be really neat. A couple more fields here. Maps processing is very interesting because at the beginning I showed you we had a map and we used ray tracing to maybe figure out what the signal strengths are. It turns out a much more lucrative field in terms of accuracy has not been to predict the Wi-Fi, but to predict human psychological decision making. Right? So if you're a human and you're at number 2 and you want to get to number 4, you probably walk through 3. You're not going to go through a straight line through the wall, and you're not going to do some crazy dance. If you do, good luck. The idea here is now we can predict ahead of time a smaller set of possibilities of where you can move. And if you can couple that, right now we can use sort of the psychological tuning to predict where you're going to go, couple that with the Wi-Fi scans, couple that with some of the more advanced inertial stuff. And your location starts to become very accurate very quickly. The hardest part of this is building these grids in the first place. And so companies like Qualcomm have invested a lot of resources in sort of the image recognition on these images to figure out what's a room, what's a hallway, where people enter, where people exit. I guess what an elevator is, that's pretty important. And extracting what are called spatial connectivity graphs out of sort of data that's already available. And so this field is still very, very early. It's quite expensive, and no one's quite cracked the code on, in this picture, the hallways are gray, the rooms are white, and what does gray mean, and which are the elevators, what's stairs, what's walkable, what's not, is not entirely clear. But there is progress in this space, and it is interesting. Magnetometers. So there's 2 more. Magnetometers is really interesting. There's a company named Indoor Atlas that made a splash, I think last month, about how even throughout a museum, the magnetic field readings that you get vary from one place to another as you walk by iron or piping or electrical cables. And just like we do some of the pattern recognition with Wi-Fi, so this is our office in Mountain View, we measured the magnetic field disturbances from one part of the room to the other, and they have as much variance, as much texture as you find in Wi-Fi in the first place. Right? So that's a hint that magnetic field disturbances may have as much sort of location guiding ability as Wi-Fi itself. And none of this has to do with the traditional use of compasses, which is just to point you north. Outdoors, this works really, really poorly because basically the compass points north at the strength of like 30 to 50 microteslas. Indoors, though, it's fantastic, it turns out, because every single part, pipe in the wall, item of furniture that you have affects this field and sort of gives you a way to detect it. And I like this picture because it was one of the seminal works in magnetometer field strength positioning, and it came from a mine shaft. I don't know what they were actually measuring. They found out the mine shaft had this rich set of location data and set the entire fluid in motion. The last section I have is the least developed. It's computer vision. There's a bunch of things you can do. I'll play this video in a moment. Some of the most interesting stuff, we're going to get back to that. Some of the most interesting stuff is that, like, if I know you're in a mall and I know where the stores are located, if your camera's on, you take a picture, or you have Google Glasses and it's watching, right? If you see a giant D, then you feel, you probably aren't beside Ross, you probably aren't beside Old Navy, but maybe you're beside one of these 3 stores that has, a D in their logo. And if you then, walk forward 10 seconds later, and you see a giant, ampersand, or, like an N or something, like how many stores have an N in their logo, but are within 5 seconds of a store that has a D in their logo, right? And so you can start doing the same sort of sequence analysis that we're doing with Wi-Fi, but with the visual cues that you see across a space. Even more common is often just like looking for bathrooms.
But that means that the markings on your map have to be the same as the signage in the...
That's right, that's right. And this is why this is like a very, very undeveloped field that shows a lot of promise. Again, what other people do is they'll look for bathroom signs. And anytime you see one, you could be in one of these 7 places. But how long does it take before you see an ATM? Or how long does it take before you see another queue? Or maybe you use Wi-Fi to help hone it down, or maybe you use some other things. Lastly, there's interesting work that's outdoors but sort of applies indoors too. The short answer here is just even across cities, the same textures have different features. And just like when we've done outdoors, there's a lot of work to do with indoors. And lastly, there's a video here about the total opposite approach. Rather, if you watch the flow of the camera as it moves, it turns out as you're walking forward, the spatial landscape sort of moves outward on the screen. If you're turning, all the pixels move in one direction. And if you treat this sort of like you treat a gyroscope, if you treat this sort of like you treat inertial sensing, you can get a rough path out on this side. This is the path that's harder to walk. We're going to walk, it's a little bit quicker because there's drift, just like any odometry-based approach, but you'll notice we make a turn here at the end, and it picks it up as it watches the screen sort of pan as one more turn. And things like this get really interesting, again, with Google Glasses or applications where cameras are available. And that's it. Those are the 6 sort of big next steps that are on the way for varying levels of success. And there's an end slide to show. And that's it. Any questions, or we can take a break?
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about the TDOA? Of course, if you're measuring the time, then you have to measure the time that it takes something to get from the router to the...
In TDOA approaches, it is critical that you know the location of the access point, the hotspot that you're actually communicating with. And then if you have that and you have a distance, then we go back to the chart we had earlier, basically with the 3 circles in Australia. Right? And so this, you can go back to this metric once you sort of have TDOA, because you know the size of the circle for each access point that you've got a time for.
an ignorant question, is it possible to determine the location of the access point?
Yes, and so that is, if you start combining multiple slides here. So the SLAM slide, right, where we did Wi-Fi, like where you're trying to fold the Wi-Fi on top of each other, you can do SLAM with TDOA, where you try to home in the location of each access point as you move through it. So yes.
I meant from the network, not from the device.
Yeah, so the networks generally know already where the access points are because someone chose to put it there.
Okay.
So yes, that information is largely available.
Take 2 more questions.
Okay, 2 more questions. Yeah, you can bring the numbers.
Applications, what do you're figuring out how to do this, what do you think would be the most popular applications of the technology?
Yeah, so so the most recent application that's launched was a group in UK called Calvium Apprens. They make audio tours for their museums. They've been looking for a way to make it accessible on mobile devices. They already have this great platform where sort of like publishers go and they author stories and it plays back and there's like this whole sound experience. It's really cool. They've added WiFiSLAM to their audio tour experience so that you can, it's neat. It's sort of like if you stand in one place, you get to hear the story about that exhibit, and as you sort of move away, it fades out and plays the next one. We've had work in sort of conferences and trade shows where there's a show floor. And then across the board, retail, security, museums, conferences I mentioned, office productivity, list goes on. So there's a lot of developers. So I think we were only supposed to take 2 more questions, and this gentleman has.
I don't know if this is worthy of the last question, but if presuming that most of the signatures you get are from APs, is it my understanding right now is that works for Android but not iOS?
Mm-hmm.
So. Can you speak, I mean, so your solution, does that work on iOS? Or do you need
So the SDK we've launched today is for Android. A lot of these other things, the magnetic field, the TDOA, the vision, most of these, the inertial even, most of the more modern breakthroughs are not limited by iOS.
But that's not currently incorporated, that's sort of on your roadmap, I guess, to incorporate those kind of inputs.
You have to talk with Apple probably.
Yeah.
So thank you. Alright, we're gonna take thank you actually for that. I've been trying to get him to do a presentation for a long time. We're gonna take a 2-minute break while we're setting up for the next class. You can go to a restroom, grab some whatever's left.
If anyone needs Wi-Fi, the password right there.